Welcome to this webinar to present EDHEC's study on greenwashing, which is entitled Doing Good or Feeling Good, Detecting Greenwashing in Climate Investing. My name is Peter O'Kelly, and I am in charge of the EDHEC division that is responsible for promoting EDHEC's research. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with EDHEC, EDHEC is one of the major business schools in the world. It's ranked in the top 10 in the world for its Masters in Management. Those are the FT rankings, and those are the FT rankings from last Monday, so it's very much up to date. EDHEC also benefits from the three major international accreditations, which are the AACSB, EQUIS, and AMBA accreditations. And as you can see on the screen, there are very few business schools in the world for which that is the case. In terms of EDHEC's expertise in finance, again, its Masters in Finance program is regularly ranked in the top 5 in the world in those same FT rankings. EDHEC Risk Institute, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, is one of the leading asset management research centers in the world. It's also the source of scientific beta, its smart beta offshoot, which was taken over by the Singapore exchange last year in a deal that was worth over 200 million euros. EDHEC Infrastructure Institute, also known as EDHEC Infra, has the largest database of infrastructure projects in the world, and it is supported by the government of Singapore, by the monetary authorities there where it's based. And finally, EDHEC has a PhD in finance program, which attracts graduates from the very top academic institutions in the world. So students do their undergraduate degree in finance in the likes of Chicago, Harvard, Wharton, Stanford, etc. And then they come to EDHEC to complete their finance education with a PhD at EDHEC. In terms of today's subject, so climate finance, this is very much a priority for EDHEC now and in the years to come. There are several initiatives here. One is cooperation with the École des Mines in Paris, set up a sustainable finance syllabus. École des Mines is, like EDHEC, one of the grandes écoles in France, so that's the equivalent of the Ivy League in the US or the Oxbridge colleges in the UK. EDHEC's developing an ambitious research program on green infrastructure and the climate risk of unlisted assets, so that follows on from what I was saying about EDHEC Infra. There's also the joint research chair with scientific beta. So the study that's being presented today was actually produced as part of this research chair on climate investing with scientific beta, which has an annual budget of over €1 million. And now looking to the future, over the next few months, we will be launching the EDHEC Risk Climate Impact Institute, which again has a considerable budget of more than €20 million for 5 years. So you can see that these are pretty serious initiatives. Just to introduce today's speakers before we begin. So Dr. Noël Amarink is the founding director of EDHEC Institute, and as I mentioned, EDHEC Risk Institute was the source of scientific beta. Noël remains CEO of Scientific Beta. He's also Associate Professor of Finance at EDHEC Singapore and a member of the EDHEC Scientific Beta Research Chair that has supported this research. Dr. Felix Goltz began his career as a researcher with EDHEC Risk Institute, where he became head of applied research for equities, and then subsequently became research director for Scientific Beta. And he is also a member of the EDHEC Scientific Beta Research Chair on Advanced ESG and Climate Investing. One final thing before we begin, you'll see that there's a Q&A box, so you can ask questions at any stage during the presentation. We'll try to answer the questions at the end, but be assured that if we don't get to your question, we'll be sure to reply subsequently by email. So thank you very much. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Felix Goltz to begin the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. more and more investors are adopting climate investing strategies. And clearly they have an objective, of why they are changing their investment practices. And that objective is that they actually want to have an impact on the climate. They want to help fight climate change through how they invest. So we're asking a very simple question, which is, well, are the current investment strategies actually suitable? So are they actually appropriate to achieve this objective? So this is a study that we worked on at the research chair, so roughly for the past 6 months. And so we're very happy to present the results. This is the first time we release the results, so we're happy to share them. But of course, we're also very happy to receive comments, suggestions, and so the Q&A will be useful for that at the end of the session. So let me go back really to the basics, just to motivate climate investing. So clearly climate change is a huge problem for humanity. And the problem is that it is a global negative externality. Okay, so the problem is that all these greenhouse gas emissions create global warming. You can see this here in this chart, which comes from the IPCC. So if you simulate kind of the natural global surface temperature, you see that that's pretty stable over time. But you see this huge increase in temperature from about the 1970s, which can be attributed to a human impact. And of course, these temperature rises create lots of damage, environmental damage, but also economic damage. So of course, things like extreme weather events, things like health problems related to higher temperature, and things like sea level rise. And so the problem is that these damages, they occur globally, but the person that emits is not directly actually bearing these consequences. So this is this problem of an externality. And that also means that, if you just leave kind of things to themselves, markets are not going to fix this problem. There's going to be too much damage, basically, that will be created. So what can we do about this problem? Essentially, there's two types of action that you can think about. And the idea is really, to attack this externality by actually internalizing the costs of climate change, to those who are actually causing climate change. So there's public policy action, because there's lots of debate about what governments should do, what legislators should do. And the idea here is that you can actually reduce the overall level of emissions simply by putting a price on these carbon emissions, or more generally, any greenhouse gas emissions. So there's different ways of doing that, but that would obviously achieve that, polluters will bear the costs, and in the end, it'll only be the kind of most crucial uses of emissions. That's where the emissions would occur. So you have this kind of efficient allocation through this pricing mechanism, but also you could simply have regulation that just say limits emissions or just prohibits certain activities. So that's what public policy can do. Now, private action is also possible, and in particular, private capital can also contribute to the fight against climate change. And so the idea here is that private capital can actually contribute through an influence on firms. So firms, to develop their activities, need capital. And so private capital can influence the behavior of firms by how the private sector allocates capital. So there's these two mechanisms. And what we're focusing here is obviously a form of private action. So how can actually investors contribute to the fight against climate change? And this is actually a kind of growing trend, and there's growing recognition that investors could do something, and more investors are actually motivated to use their capital, and they're not only going to consider financial returns and financial risk, but they're also starting to consider non-financial objectives. So just as an example of this form of investing, I'm showing here some data on the signatories of the Principles for Responsible Investing. So this is responsible investing in general. This is not just concerning the climate. But if you look at the number of signatories here, you can see that Currently we're close to 4,000 signatories. So if you go back to about 2011, so about 10 years ago, that was only at 1,000. So basically you have a fourfold growth in the number of asset managers and asset owners that actually sign these principles and promise to adhere to these principles, pursuing non-financial objectives with their investments. You can also look at the assets under management, and similarly you see about a fourfold, maybe even higher growth. So currently we're somewhere slightly beyond 120 trillion US dollars, and again that's up from something like 25 trillion about 10 years ago. So clearly strong growth of adopting these responsibility objectives and non-financial objectives in investing. And in particular in the area of climate change, investors have actually formed alliances, and they've made it very clear that they are pursuing a real world impact through their investments. And this really is something that follows from the Paris Agreement. So again, the Paris Agreement with an objective to limit global warming, will have consequences for public policy. Okay, so countries that actually, adopted this agreement will, make policy decisions to actually align with these objectives. But also the private sector can do something, and there are two important investor groups that have actually formed just recently, and these investor groups make it very clear that what they want to achieve is clearly to contribute to this objective, which is to limit global warming. And this requires to actually, not emit any greenhouse gas by about the middle of the century. So at least on a net basis, if you account for, maybe some remaining emissions and then maybe some removal of emissions on a net basis, the objective is to be at zero. So this is also called the net zero investing. And there are two very important initiatives. So the first is the Paris Aligned Investment Initiative. And this initiative actually represents investors with about 9 trillion US dollars of assets. So these are, some large pension funds, for example. Another initiative is the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which also has a similar objective. And the members in this alliance control about 6 trillion US dollars. So very clearly there's a strong movement among investors. So they actually want to have an impact. They want to push companies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and make sure that companies are actually aligned with these objectives of the Paris Agreement. Now the question then is, well, how can investors actually achieve such an impact? So it's really important to think about the mechanisms of impact, and this is important so that the actual investment choices and investment strategies, ultimately also are appropriate. And so a first point that is actually important is just to know that investors, they actually don't have any direct control over firms' emissions. So it's kind of an ambitious objective for investors to have a real world impact, because they are only holding shares of companies, and they basically cannot, let's say, press a button or pull a switch or something to actually directly control what the company is doing. So how then can they actually have impact on firms? Well, there's basically two channels. So, in the end, it'll be the firms, of course, that will change, their production technology, for example. That will change maybe the kind of products that they manufacture. That will change maybe the kind of practices and processes that they have in place. But what investors can do is actually two different things. So first of all, investors can actually affect a firm's ability to grow. Okay, so what investors would like to do is they would like to facilitate the growth of, for example, firms that contribute to climate solutions. They would like to, allow firms to grow that, invest in new technology that actually help tackle climate change, and they will want to achieve that, very brown activities with a negative impact on the environment and the climate will actually not be able to be grown. So that's the first thing that investors can do. And a second thing that investors can do is even for a given company, okay, you can try to make sure that that company is actually doing something to reduce their emissions. So the first one is more a quantity aspect, right? So trying to make sure that there's more companies that are very green, that it's more easy for them to grow. And the second one is more a quality consideration. So just trying to push companies to actually become greener. And there's two channels through which investors can have this impact. So the first one is the capital supply channel. The second one is the engagement channel. So the capital supply channel is quite simple. So basically, firms have a demand for capital. Investors provide this capital. And so by choosing how investors provide capital, they can actually set some incentives and allow actually firms to, for example, invest in new technology. They can allow for the green firms to actually increase their scale. And this would lead to a positive impact on the real world. A second channel is quite different. That's engagement. So engagement is really not about the actual investment action and investment decisions. Engagement is really about discussions with the management of the companies. So any investor can have dialogue with management. So just imagine a very large pension fund that has, for example, stopped to invest in a given stock of a very brown company that the investor, the pension fund, say, just judges that this company has the wrong practices. So, of course, this investor can then have dialogue with the management and say, these are the things that you have to do for us to become an investor in your shares. So that's kind of dialogue, informal dialogue with management. The second form of engagement would be, well, if you actually are a shareholder of the company, well, you can vote at general meetings. And so shareholder voting on resolutions or proposing resolutions, etc., can also influence companies. So these are the different channels. And what we are doing in our studies, really, we try to look quite carefully, how can you actually use these channels, and what do investment strategies, have to look like in order to be able to exploit these challenges. So with that, I'll leave the floor to Noel to explain the different forms of how investors actually cannot have impact and how you can actually prevent this impact from happening.
Yes, thank you, Felix. So yes, what you presented is what we call virtue. And the relationship between capital supply and engagement are very important also. It means that they are not independent actions. For example, it will be a little bit strange if in a shareholder meeting or if publicly as an investor you blame the management and at the same time you increase your investment in the company. It will be a little bit double bind, or because financial people now like behavioral finance, okay? Speaking about behavioral, it will be a little bit inconsistent behavioral level to make strong criticism on the non-alignment of the company or the deterioration of the climate by the company, and in the same time increasing the weight of the stock. This is all about, being consistent. But if we go into detail, we will see that we have different forms of climate investing greenwashing. First of all, affirm engagement for the climate without engaging. When you are an asset manager, you know that your client, the investor, are looking for engagement. So you will somewhere mention that you are prepared to engage. You will be participant of investor coalitions. But in the fact, you are doing like in the past. You are supporting the current management, even of the company, even this management do not take serious commitment on climate. You are not supporting critical climate resolution in shareholder meetings. So you affirm your engagement, but you are doing nothing. Another form of more subtle greenwashing is to accuse the greenwashing from issuer. obviously, not only asset manager, not only investor are under pressure from the society, from the stakeholder about making good things for climate. The corporate who are looking for this famous capital supply or for the approval of their decision by investor are subject to high, intense green pressure, okay, to act for climate. And they present plan, and they present commitment, and they took commitment. Sometimes these commitments are not serious. Sometimes these action plans are not realistic. A form of greenwashing, if you are an investor with a serious expertise, is to approve this plan even if you know that they are not serious. So you engage with company. The company not really engaged, is not really engaged, but the kind of, okay, a deal with this company, saying, okay, we approve what you are saying even if we are not super convinced, even if at the end what you are doing is not seriously aligned. This is what we call engagement greenwashing. I will provide you some concrete example in the following slide. Portfolio greenwashing. Portfolio greenwashing is probably less popular topics than engagement greenwashing. Why? Because engagement greenwashing is under the scrutiny of NGO, of public policy. We have a lot of, let's say, also media scrutiny on this engagement greenwashing. It's quite easy to know what was the policy vote during the shareholder meeting. It's quite easy to analyze the alignment plans which are public, and you have also capacity, external expertise to somewhere judge the alignment plan of the corporate. Portfolio greenwashing is more subtle. First of all, because it's difficult to get the data. Portfolios are not transparent. For various reasons, including IP protection, it's difficult to have public available data on what are really in the portfolio, especially in European portfolio. So somewhere you have two kinds of portfolio greenwashing. First, like affirming engagement, you can affirm the importance of climate data, of climate performance of the company for portfolio decision. But in fact, you're not really using it. You display fantastic data, you make a very ambitious speech about the data you are using for your portfolio, but at the final stage, this data do not matter. This is the important piece of our research we are presenting today. Second form of greenwashing, and they are not orthogonal, you are displaying a very nice reduction in carbon or temperature score. I mean, in backward or forward-looking carbon data at portfolio level, but at stock level, this carbon reduction, this temperature score are not consistent. You create a very nice low carbon portfolio, but you continue to invest in climate deteriorator, in companies who are year by year making the worst thing for the climate. These are the four popular forms of greenwashing. Today, the presentation will focus on portfolio greenwashing. So I will just provide you two examples on engagement greenwashing, and I will leave the floor to Felix to present the study. First of all, engagement greenwashing, when you affirm that you are engaged, but in fact, you are not really engaged. You are not really taking care of climate resolution climate proposal when you are acting as a responsible investors participating to shareholder meeting. You have here the analysis of 2020 vote on climate critical resolution. You see that you have a very large dispersion of the vote among very popular, very important asset manager on climate critical resolution. Okay? And this is part of what we call engagement greenwashing. Let's take, for example, the most famous, BlackRock. BlackRock in 2020, early 2020, was very vocal on his adherence and joining Climate Action 100+ coalitions. BlackRock CEO was really stating that the world should change, and as a very important asset manager, the most important asset manager in the world, he will challenge corporate. He will challenge company for climate question, for climate alignment question. Unfortunately, even if BlackRock was member of the Climate Action 100+ coalition, he voted against 10 of 12 climate resolution flagged by the Climate Alliance, by Climate Action Plus Alliance. Even he was a very important member of his coalition, even if his coalition supported 12 very important climate resolution among the companies proposal, he voted against. In fact, Vanguard and BlackRock were systematically against any kind of climate resolution. On S&P 500, they vote only 3 on 36 for BlackRock and 4 on 36 resolution for climate for the S&P 500 stocks in shareholder meeting. This is the first form of, let's say, greenwashing. You affirm you engage, you affirm that your decision, your vote will be derived by climate consideration, but in fact, you are supporting the current management. You are supporting the current practices. Probably because you are heavily involved in this company. And somewhere this is a part of your day-to-day business to continue to be invested and to continue to do as you are doing in the past with this company. This is one form of greenwashing engagement. We speak about also engaged company, corporate. Shell presented a net zero alignment plan for 2050. You know that if you want to respect Paris Agreement objective, you have to be net zero in 2050. So you have a lot of companies now who are presenting net zero alignment plans. The net zero alignment plan presented by Shell was approved by 88% of the investors. 1 week after, this plan was condemned by the district court of The Hague, by the Dutch, let's say, court, for being insufficient and not taking really care of the climate. When the law exists, when you have case for that, you see that the courts are more ambitious than the investors, even if the investors are affirming that they are looking to improve climate situation. And why this plan was condemned? Because in fact, the way Shell presented the plan was based on the reduction of carbon intensity, not carbon emission somewhere. Carbon intensity means that you continue to have carbon emission, but you increase your revenue in non-oil and gas activities in way that the ratio between carbon emission and revenue is improving. But looking what happened for Shell for the next years, Shell will continue to spend money on oil and gas. Shell will continue to increase its spending on oil and gas industry. Shell will continue to increase its net carbon emission in the oil and gas industry. Last but not least, large part of the alignment of Shell will be carbon capture, with completely unrealistic hypotheses. Somewhere, if Shell want to satisfy the carbon capture plan, it should reforest the entire Brazil to obtain the real compensation, the real, let's say, capture of its carbon emission. This is what we call also greenwashing at company level. I will now leave the floor to Felix for presenting the core of the study, which is portfolio greenwashing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So we're really focusing on climate investing strategies and the way in which these strategies allocate weights to different stocks. So the key focus is really on the portfolio construction. And so before we actually turn to the study and the results, it's useful to just recall what are the key characteristics of popular climate strategies. And there's three important characteristics of these strategies. The first one is there's a clear focus on reducing the average carbon intensity across the portfolio. So if you see the communication around these investment products, you will typically see, okay, we have reduced the, let's say the carbon intensity, so carbon emitted per unit of revenue by, 30% relative to a standard market index. The regulation also focuses on these weighted average carbon intensity metrics. So you have regulation, for example, that imposes that these, certain objectives have to be reached, and that actually this reduction has to actually grow over time. So there has to be like a kind of a reduction relative to the past in terms of this weighted average carbon intensity. And that's important to notice. So the main objective is actually not an objective at the level of the individual firm, but is actually at the kind of overall weighted average. So this is something that you can kind of show immediately and easily to investors. But the question that will arise, as we will see, is how consistent is that actually? Because who's going to have a real world impact? It has to be the individual firm that has to actually act. And so we're going to look into this question in detail. The second main characteristic of these climate strategies is that they try to maintain a very low level of tracking error with the cap-weighted index. And so what this also means is that these strategies do not actually change the reference, right? They do not actually change kind of the main component, which is, most investment strategies are benchmarked to a cap-weighted market index. So basically what these strategies say is we don't want to deviate to a significant extent from these market benchmarks. Of course, you can already see that there may be a problem here if you have ambitious objectives. The third criterion, the third characteristic, is that these climate investment portfolios do not actually pay attention to allocation to key economic sectors that are needed for the transition. Okay, so rather than increasing an overall green score, you may want to think carefully about how do you treat a sector such as electricity, for example, which very clearly can make a large contribution to the transition. So if companies switch and transform so that they can produce electricity that consumers want and companies want without actually emitting greenhouse gases, that would be a major step, and this is an important requirement for actually reaching these net zero objectives. But quite often what we see in these investment strategies is that they don't actually look at these key economic sectors. Instead, quite often they look at very broad categories of sectors. So there's EU regulation, for example, that requires portfolios to be balanced across what is called high and low climate intensity sectors. But these sectors are kind of so broad that it's really not very challenging to respect this kind of balance, and it's also not very meaningful to respect this kind of balance. So what do we do in the study? How do we actually represent climate investing, and how do we analyze it? So first of all, what we do is we build investment strategies. So we're actually looking at data for stocks in a global stock market universe, a typical world index that investors would use as a starting point. And then we design these climate strategies in that world stock universe by doing two things. So first of all, we're using climate scores that are commonly used in the industry, so carbon emissions related metrics. And secondly, we're using portfolio methodologies that are also commonly used in practice to actually design these climate investment strategies. So we're actually using kind of two broad types of investment methodologies, and we're actually looking at 8 different carbon metrics. So our objective is simply to have quite general conclusions. So our conclusion will hold across a large number of popular carbon metrics and also across different types of climate strategies that are used in practice. Now, what I would like to note is that, first of all, if you look at these strategies, the strategies we create actually achieve a very strong reduction of the overall carbon intensity. So what we find on average is an 83% reduction relative to the CAP weighted index. So if you look at it, on the surface, these climate strategies clearly, look very green. We're reducing the carbon emissions metrics by 83%. Okay, so that number is in the study. It's not reported here on the slide. Now, we could be satisfied with these 83%, just like product providers and investment managers focus a lot on these kind of headline numbers. But we actually want to go a bit further, and we want to assess different criteria to see whether really these portfolios are aligned with impact. And we have 3 criteria to check that. So the first one is, I think, very basic. So we're just looking at the question, so does the climate score actually have a strong impact on the stock weights? Okay, so we're trying to figure out what actually determines the weights. If I have 2 stocks, one with a very high weight, one with a very low weight, if my strategy is mainly about the climate, I should see that, well, these differences are due to the climate score of these stocks, right? The very high score stock that is kind of very green will get a high weight, and the very brown stock will get a low weight. There shouldn't really be another reason for why I'm holding these stocks in these proportions. So first of all, we're assessing what are actually the factors that impact the stock weights, and how important is actually the climate score. The second criterion we look at is what happens to actually stocks that deteriorate in terms of their climate performance. So this, again, is a very common sense criterion. So what would you expect a green investment strategy to do if a company actually worsens over time in terms of its climate impact, right? So let's say the amount of greenhouse gases emitted per unit of revenue actually increases over time, right? So this is clearly complete failure to align with a transition objective. And so what you would expect this climate investing strategy to do clearly is that it shouldn't reward such a stock with an increase in the weight. And so we're just going to check how often that is actually the case. And the third criterion is we're just going to look whether the key sectors, like the electricity sector, is actually represented in these strategies. The idea, again, is that key sectors need capital for the transition. So if you basically allow the strategy to remove any allocation to these key sectors, that would be inconsistent with alignment. So the idea behind these tests is really, well, we're taking actually what we see as really kind of reasonable and perhaps even minimum requirements to actually achieve some kind of impact, and we're just looking at these different strategies. Now, let's turn first to this question of, so does the climate score really matter? And I can illustrate the question with this example here. So this is a hair care product. The label clearly says it's argan gold, argan gold hair care product. It even says it's 100% argan oil, etc. So clearly the label makes this promise to the consumer. And the question is then, well, what happens really if you look a little bit more closely? And in this case, if you look a little bit more closely, what's not written on the label, but what's written somewhere in the list of ingredients is that, well, I think the argan oil makes up something like less than 1%, and the actual gold obviously is something like way less than 1 part per million. It's like 0.01 part per million, and that's obviously something that consumers are familiar with. So this is this kind of very cheap marketing trick that you put something on the label, which actually most of the product is about something else, and in this case, it's going to mostly be about some lubricant that is inside this bottle. But of course, it doesn't say lubricant hair oil. It tells you something else on the label. So the question we have is, well, are climate strategies subject to similar kind of labeling issues, and are they really about lots of lubricant or detergent, and not really so much about these noble products that are supposed to be inside? So here's the result from our study. We actually analyze the determinants of weight differences across stocks. And what we find is that 88% of differences in the stock weights are actually unrelated to the carbon intensity measure, right? So only 12% are actually driven by the climate metric. The large majority of what influences the weight are other aspects. And the main aspect here is simply the market value of a stock. So since these strategies are anchored on cap-weighted indices, what mostly explains why a stock has a high weight is, well, the stock has a high market cap. And actually, the climate score, it doesn't really play a role for, how these weights are allocated. It plays a very small role compared to the market cap. So in the end, what matters is this traditional, financial criterion. Now, we also look at strategies that combine climate objectives with other social responsibility objectives. And this is quite a popular approach. Quite often, investors who care about the climate, they also think that other objectives are important. But here we see a problem with mixing climate and other objectives. And you can see that if you actually mix in other objectives, the impact of the climate score is even less. That's quite sensible, of course, if you don't set a clear priority on the climate, if you also start to evaluate stocks about things like labor relations, etc., then actually the climate becomes even less impactful. So in those strategies that mix different objectives, actually 93% of the weight is actually unrelated to the climate. And so there's a very clear conclusion that these climate investing strategies are really mostly not driven by climate considerations. Now, you could ask the question, okay, maybe there's a good reason for that. And so, perhaps investors are just so familiar with these market benchmarks that they just, can be reassured by staying close to them. But clearly, if the objective is to transition to a different economy that has net zero greenhouse gas emissions, we know that this requires a change in activity on a drastic scale. And so it also requires reallocation of capital at a drastic scale. And so if you just build portfolios that don't look very different really from standard market indices, it's not clear how you're going to achieve a drastic change by making very small deviations. So, the first criterion, the first analysis shows us that, unfortunately, climate factors, climate characteristics only play a very small role. Now, we wanted to look further at the incentives that these strategies set for individual firms. And what we look at is what happens to firms that actually deteriorate in terms of their climate intensity. And you see the results here. So across these different strategies, stocks that actually deteriorate may get an increasing weight, okay, or they may get a decreasing weight. So that's exactly the question we were interested in. And we see that across the different strategies, on average, about 1/3 of stocks that are deteriorators actually get an increasing weight in that strategy. Now, we think that a kind of a plausible rule and kind of a plausible criterion that should be respected is that, if you care about the climate, you're not going to increase your allocation to companies that are actually doing the wrong thing, that are just completely at the wrong end of the spectrum and that are actually worsening in terms of their impact on the climate. And, yet what happens? Well, actually, in about 1/3 of the cases, these strategies actually increase the weight. And let me just emphasize that this is really a very, let's say, soft criterion. So we're not even looking at whether these strategies hold any deteriorators. Okay, let's say, okay, these strategies are still going to hold some stocks that deteriorate. Okay, that's not what this percentage shows, right? It's not the stocks that deteriorate which are actually held by these strategies. This is something different. So let's accept that these strategies hold some deteriorators. The thing we're looking at here is really just whether they increase the weight over time, right? So basically, if a strategy just holds on to a deteriorator, that's not going to appear here, right? So here, to appear here, you really have to have the case where the deteriorator actually gets an increase in weight. And so this is clearly problematic from the perspective of engagement. And so Noel mentioned this problem of consistency. So if you hold dialogue with companies, you also need to ensure that that dialogue is credible, right? So if investors, on the one hand, try to push companies to do more to actually, fight climate change, and on the other hand, management sees that, well, we actually have worsened, and yet these strategies still increase their weight in our stock, it's really not clear how corporate managers will actually get any clear signal from these strategies. Now, the third question we look at is the question of the key economic sectors, and we're taking the example here of the electricity sector. So electricity, generation clearly is an area where companies can do a lot to fight climate change by moving to, carbon neutral and green sources of electricity. And so the problem that this sector faces is basically to have access to capital to actually finance this transition. At the same time, of course, if you take this sector, since companies still use traditional sources of to generate electricity, the sector will have a high carbon intensity compared to other sectors. So what we ask is, well, do these climate strategies simply reduce the electricity sector weight that will allow them to show this nice carbon score, like we're showing an 83% reduction. But of course, in the real world, it's not really clear how that's going to solve any issues. We're not going to do away with an electricity sector. Instead, we need that sector to reform. The results are quite striking. So the electricity sector receives huge underweights in these different portfolios. Again, we're looking here at these two different methods. So one is this tilted portfolio method. The other one uses portfolio optimization. Both of them are quite similar in that they focus on these, portfolio level weighted average scores. They look very green, but they actually achieve that in part by having a huge reduction of the electricity sector, 90% in the case of some of these strategies. And that will allow to show that the portfolio looks very green on a weighted average basis. But of course, it doesn't solve the issue of actually allowing and supporting the transition of the electricity sector. We try to illustrate this problem with this very simple picture here. So, the bottom line is you can remove the electricity sector from your portfolio, but you're not going to remove the electricity sector from the real economy. That's not, we're not going to run our household appliances without electricity. So the question really is not, whether you can remove this sector to show some nice score. Is actually what do you do in the real world, and how do you actually push companies to do the right thing in the real world. And so this is where we say clearly, if companies are in a carbon intensive industry, they may have higher carbon intensity than a very green company or even than the average company. So holding these companies doesn't help to show a nice green score, but these companies may still have a high value added to actually work towards this transition. And clearly these firms need capital to invest. So constructing these portfolios, just to ensure the optics and without actually providing a way of providing capital to these key sectors is clearly not something that is likely to lead to any impact. So those were the three criteria that we assessed. And let me just recap the kind of key results really of the study. So clearly what we find from the strategies that we analyze is that these climate investing strategies, clearly achieve large optical effects. They achieve this 83% reduction in a headline carbon measure, but at the same time, they are completely inconsistent with achieving a real-world impact. We've seen three reasons for that. Carbon scores have very little impact. Deteriorators may actually get rewarded with increasing weights, and simply shutting out a key sector again is not likely to give incentives to some of these companies in the sector to actually do something. And the kind of reason behind this is really that what these climate strategies do is really not so new. So they just apply standard portfolio construction. Okay, so these portfolio construction methods, they work just like how people would design, like, say, a growth index, for example, for growth stocks. Simply instead of looking at a growth criterion, you just look now at a green criterion. So the portfolio construction method doesn't actually take into account the specifics of climate investing. And also the main reference, clearly is these cap-weighted indices, and that just severely limits the role of the actual climate data that you're using. So you have lots of discussion on, what is the best data, how do you actually measure the climate impact of a company? But in the end, this data is not actually really put to a lot of use. It has a very small impact. And so how does this portfolio greenwashing actually affect the industry overall? Well, we think that the results from our study are clearly very relevant to the investment industry because clearly 100% of funds that actually have this label of being climate aligned, well, they are actually affected by the issues that we underline, right? And so what is really needed is that investors should assess these kind of criteria more carefully. We also emphasize that regulation that exists does not actually protect against this form of greenwashing. So as I mentioned earlier, the EU regulation on these Paris-aligned benchmarks very much focuses on these headline intensity reductions. And as we've seen, you can have substantial reductions in these headline measures that doesn't actually necessarily allow you to have any impact. And so the key driver really behind this greenwashing is that the industry relies very heavily on tracking error with standard indices. And, that's kind of the tradition of the industry, that everything is conditioned by these cap-weighted indices. But of course, if you don't change your reference, right, if you don't change the benchmark around which portfolios are constructed, you're also not going to end up with meaningful change. And so Noel mentioned these claims that asset managers make about really reshaping fundamentally the world of finance. Well, if you just stick to the same old cap-weighted indices as a reference and you deviate very marginally from them, well, you're actually not reshaping. You're not reshaping finance. You're actually allowing for very little change. And so what we think is that the industry should really go back to the basics and really consider, well, what are actually the portfolio construction methods that are relevant, and to actually develop methods that are actually more consistent with impact. So with that, I leave the floor to Noel for additional comments.
Yes, thank you, Felix. To conclude, what really we want to today convey to the audience is we don't believe that in portfolio construction people are trained to do things not in the right way. We don't believe that they don't intend to be good. We just are saying that even if the intention is good, the method is not the right one. If climate change is a war, we should think like a war organization. I don't think the Allied won the Second World War doing the thing that they have done during the peace time. So we need to think differently. We need to obtain to invest in different strategy, making climate objectives the first objective of the portfolio. Not trying to mix financial and climate objectives. Not trying to mix climate and financial data, because at the end, if you do that, and you want to maintain your tracking error constraint, you will put less attention, you will put less influence of your climate objective and climate data. The real question now is to change portfolio construction practices. Regulators are probably not so well placed to help us. Regulators are not financial specialists, are not financial engineers. So let's be clear, let's try to define some norms, some, let's say, key indicators for making sure that this portfolio is really green. In our report, we propose that we should not call green portfolio a portfolio where less than 50% of the driver of the weight of the stock are climate data. Thank you very much for your attention. Now it's time for questions. Felix?
Yes, so we got a lot of questions actually. So I'll just try to ask some questions also that maybe came kind of several times. So the main ones. Obviously, we'll, as I mentioned, we'll reply to questions also after this session. So we'll send you a written reply if you have asked a question. So yeah, maybe the first question I will ask is about power of the investor to engage. So let me just read the question. So the question is, how much power does a shareholder really have at the engagement level? If the corporation doesn't pay attention, then what is the threat if you can't mobilize other shareholders to vote similarly as you, or is the threat to disinvest? So maybe, Noel, do you want to comment on that? Or? No, so yeah, then I'll just say a few words on that.
Okay. First of all, yes, of course, this is what we call also the minority dilemma. It's the reason why you have coalitions. It's the reason why it's so important also when you have main player in the coalition that this main player plays the role of the coalition, not only to mention their adhesion to the coalition, but to act as a coalition. Engagement is a very powerful tool to change corporate practice as soon as investors align themselves to the objective. So this is very important. Also, if you have a serious investor and at the end you see that you cannot change the corporate attitude, the management of the corporation's attitude, exclusion is also a good signal. Okay, if you send the message that you are excluding these stocks, even if you are minority shareholders, this message will be popular. This message will be, let's say, on social network, on the media, probably an important message. So try to engage, but exclusion is also a way for you to engage. Say that, okay, at the end, if my voice is not well considered, I will exclude this stock. I will go out and I will wait for a new attitude to come back. But obviously, the purpose of the coalition is not to not remain shareholder of stock of company we want to change. The purpose of coalition is to work together. The first objective of coalition was engagement. The question of the loophole, the consistent between engagement and portfolio practice, investment practice are quite recent. So it's not surprising that our portfolio greenwashing study is, let's say, displaying difficult results. I am an optimistic person. I think that bringing the message, conveying this message of the necessary consistency between engagement and portfolio construction will help. So yes, it's difficult, but somewhere I really believe that coalition and alignment of all the investors in this coalition are very important.
Thank you. So let me move on with questions. So another question is about EU regulation. So there's different questions around that, but just for example, a question about portfolio construction. So creating these green portfolios without consistency at the stock level. Do you think that the EU regulation is somehow incentivizing such practice by focusing on the creation of this category of green products? So maybe I can just start answering this. So we of course the question what the impact of regulation is also something we ask ourselves in the report. And so in particular, you have this regulation on these Paris-aligned indices, which actually has quite detailed criteria of what you can call a Paris-aligned benchmark. Now, if you look at this regulation, the key ingredient really is this headline reduction of carbon intensity. So the regulation goes quite far, for example, in also defining the kind of carbon intensity metric that you have to use. But clearly, the focus is, again, this weighted average portfolio score. And so, this clearly simply doesn't address this problem of consistency at the stock level. And, it puts, the focus very much on these headline measures. So in this sense, clearly the regulation doesn't actually allow any, protection against these effects that we describe. And we actually did address that in the study. So we have our base case, which just constructs portfolios without, particular regulatory constraints. But we also look at a version of these strategies where we actually enforce them to respect this trajectory. So the key element in this Paris-aligned benchmark regulation is this trajectory that you have a reduction over the cap-weighted index when you start off, and then basically each year you have a reduction of that carbon metric. And so clearly the focus is entirely on this weighted average reduction. And so I would say clearly the regulation doesn't actually address this issue that we highlight here.
Yes, to complement your answer, Felix, I will say that for me, Euro regulation favor greenwashing, because when a regulation provides a label, and Paris-aligned benchmark is a label, but and obviously investor will rely on this label. But this label does not mean that the portfolio is aligned. For me, the regulation favors greenwashing. If you don't have the regulation, what are you doing as an investor? You will do very thorough due diligence. You will go deeper. Because you have this label, say, oh, I am safe. European regulation is probably the most advanced regulation regarding climate in the world. Paris-aligned is some things I like. So Paris-aligned benchmark should be aligned with Paris-aligned agreement. And Paris-aligned agreement is about carbon reduction in the real economy. So probably this Paris-aligned regulation for my fund, for my index, is the right one. In fact, because this regulation do not tackle the problem of individual stocks, deteriorators, do not protect key sector like electricity, because the broad protection is high and low intensive, carbon intensive sector, which is not really a hard constraint. Somewhere this regulation decrease the natural defense of the investor. It means the due diligence effort and favor greenwashing. So we were very vocal about this regulation. We participate to a consultation, but we really believe that this regulation was driven by a political agenda, showing that Europe is doing the right things. But really, we are not convinced that by the quality of this regulation, and this regulation will not solve the problem.
All right, so maybe I'll just choose the last question and then we can conclude. So one question also that appeared, I think several times, is really about the impact on the cost of capital that investors can actually reasonably expect. For example, so I take this one. So according to research papers, divestments will only lead to a small increase in a company's cost of capital. So as long as you don't have a majority of capital that is invested responsibly, you will have very little impact on the cost of capital. So how would you account for this problem? So I can maybe start with a few remarks on that. Clearly there's a question of the magnitude of that impact. Clearly, if you're just a very small investor and you reduce your weight in a given company, or you actually divest from a company, you're not going to expect any impact from that. And so there's different papers that look at how many investors do you actually need. So one of the early papers, for example, argues there's really kind of a 20% threshold set that you need to have at least 20% of investors that will reduce the weight or divest from a company before this will have a meaningful impact on the cost of capital. But these estimates, they are quite rough. So clearly, this I think is just something that emphasizes this criticism that we made on these low impact of climate criteria, right? So what we're basically saying is, given the current strategies, even if 100% of investors or 90% of investors follow these strategies, since the strategies are so close to the cap-weighted index, that impact on the cost of capital will be very low. And so the fact that you need a certain threshold before you actually have a noticeable impact on the cost of capital, it really just also means that you have to have a strong deviation from the cap-weighted index, because if that deviation is very small, you're obviously you will actually have this problem more and more, that you're only going to have a small impact on the cost of capital. So this is actually the kind of feature of capital allocation. So to actually influence cost of capital, you need some critical mass of investors, and you also need a benchmark that is sufficiently different. Now, once you have a large number of people who adopt a very different benchmark, I think it's quite well documented that you will actually see a reaction of stock prices and valuation of stocks. So this is well documented, for example, with even cap-weighted market indices, that at least for the popular cap-weighted market indices, you do see that lots of investors following these benchmarks, that actually creates an impact on company valuation, and then also changes the company cost of capital. A second remark I would make is that maybe this, all these problems, right, with any impact channel, so it's actually never easy to have impact. This also means that what's really important is to combine these different channels of impact. So what's probably important is, well, to not only, for example, change your portfolio weights, but then, for example, to also have an engagement strategy. And if the two are combined, the two go together, you actually have two impacts. You will have an impact actually of, for example, reducing your weight in a company that, let's say, is becoming more brown. But in addition, so you have impact through the capital allocation, but in addition, if you have dialogue with the company, together with this credible threat that there's going to be even further reduction in your capital, having the two work together will be even more powerful. And that's actually something that, these investor initiatives also emphasize. So the question of consistency of your weights is also very important.
I just want to add just a little comment, Felix, about also this question of tracking error. Our main criticism at the end is not the fact that investors want to maintain a reasonable tracking error. Our main criticism is the way how they obtain this tracking error. If they try to obtain this tracking error by optimizing a carbon score objective with a constraint of tracking error, we will see clearly a risk of sector deviation and sacrificing some sectors. If the idea is to maintain the tracking error just tilting the current cap weight, you will see clearly a risk of deteriorators, okay? Because you will be more driven by the change of cap than the change of, let's say, carbon intensity or score if you are looking for forward-looking data, if you are using forward-looking data. In fact, you can achieve a nice tracking error control, maintaining the alignment of sector because you want to be consistent with the real economy. So you don't want to do what we call greenwashing by sector compression. So this will allow you to have somewhere a good management of tracking error, but really tracking the stock. So it means that in your composition of tracking error, you have what we call the idiosyncratic risk of tracking error and the systematic risk of tracking error. Let's work on the idiosyncratic risk of tracking error. It means let's allow us to modify intra-sector weight. And this intra-sector weight should be driven by the corporate performance or the climate performance of the stocks. This is something investors, asset managers should explore seriously. Instead of trying to push two buttons, one is a tracking error constraint button, and the other one is a carbon emission, global emission button. I call that the green one and the red one. Be serious. Make your job. You have all the data to select among each sector to do a real intra-sector allocation based on climate performance. And as soon as you have done that, you have done a good job. So I'm not saying that investors for investability consideration, liquidity consideration should not have any attention of financial criteria, but they should have another way to tackle the tracking error risk, putting the climate performance of the company as a main objective, as a main driver of the stocks, looking at the relative weight of each company intra-sector instead of having this easy way to construct portfolio with optimizer. Optimizer are, for climate consideration, a devil. So let's try to not use this devil. I don't think optimizer is only a devil for climate consideration. It's for me a devil for a lot of robustness questions. So let's be robust with climate as we try to do robustness as an objective for portfolio, financial portfolio. So just want to emphasize this on that. We don't want also to make any criticism of any fund. Yes, in our study, and this study is available, is a material available through our website. And today you can download the study attending this conference. In the study, we have some example of fund just to illustrate the strategy issue. But we don't want to make any, let's say, spotlight of any fund. We are really thinking that the industry want to act properly. Just have the proper method. That's clear.
All right, so I think we are out of time for additional questions. We received lots of questions that unfortunately we're not able to answer now. So we'll actually go through all of them and we'll reply to each of you on the question that you ask, just in writing afterwards. So thank you very much for allowing us to share these results with you. Thank you for your questions as well. So this concludes our webinar, and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you very much.